So welcome everybody to the first question and answer. So this is one of three that we will be doing every second Saturday for the next couple of months. Just so you're aware, this session is going to be recorded and it will be put on my website at some point. So if you decide that you don't want to be in the recording, just share your questions in the chat. If you do come off of mute and share something, just know that you probably will be part of that recording. And so the format for today, we're going to do question and answer for about an hour, the first hour. And then after that, we will spend the last 15 to 20 minutes doing a breath work and meditation exercise to help stimulate your nervous system, bring it into better regulation, settle your brain, and kind of transition from our Q&A back into the rest of your weekend. So to begin, anyone who wants to ask a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll start with the chat for now, and then later on, I'll bring people on who maybe want to share a question. So for those of you who are less familiar with Zoom, if you look along the bottom row in your Zoom application, you'll see along the bottom there's a menu and there's a chat function. So if you click on that chat function, it will bring up the chat and you can type in any messages that you have into the chat, and we will start that way. So I'm just going to So while we're waiting for questions to come up, I can answer or can just give a few suggestions as far as brain retraining goes. So the biggest thing to remember when you're in the process of brain retraining is that it's the actions that you take that make the biggest difference to your well-being, right? So what that means is we can have a theoretical knowledge of understanding brain retraining, understanding how it works and the theory behind it. But unless we're actively and consistently and repetitively applying that information, it's challenging to make those changes in your brain. So it really is one of those things that the more you use the tool, the more benefit you get out of it, right? And so it is something that we really want to apply consistently as opposed to just have an understanding. And it's very much in alignment with most people with limbic system impairment to want to have an intellectual understanding or knowledge of something, right? It's like, I think in some ways the limbic system thinks that, okay, if I understand this or I collect more information or get more knowledge, that's what's going to help me move forward or help me move out of it. But in actuality, it's the practical application that changes your brain. And so that's just a good thing to keep in mind. It's something that's been coming up in sessions recently. So I thought I would share that. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet. If anyone wants to or would prefer to share just live, feel free to raise your hand, either with the raise hand function or just raise your hand and I can bring you on. If there's anyone who wants to share that way, you're more than welcome to do so. A lot of quiet people this morning. So the whole purpose of a question and answer is for me to answer your questions. I can't do that if there aren't any questions. So feel free. There's no such thing as a bad question. So if there's anything on your mind that you want to talk about or have a better understanding of, please feel free to do so. All right.
I can ask a question, which
Sure.
I know, Candy, I've probably asked you this question many times, but it's about reintroducing foods. So I've had sort of an up and down journey with reintroducing foods. And so I just thought I'd ask you for just your tips on how to, I guess, reintroduce foods when I've had some setbacks and just how you would go about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, there's a few things to keep in mind when we're reintroducing foods. Starting with watching what our thought patterns and our belief systems are around the foods, or even the idea of reintroducing foods. And there may be other ones around the specific foods that you're reintroducing. And so it's really important to be mindful of our internal conversation, our thoughts, our languaging around what we're saying to ourselves about that. And in combination with that, of course, whenever we're reintroducing foods, we want to consider sandwiching that experience with rounds of practice. And so, what that means is that you can use the reintroduction of food as a trigger for your round of practice. So, let's say you take a little bit of that food, and we'll talk about how to incrementally train with food in a second and work your way up. But let's assume you're taking in a little bit of that food. You want to immediately pair that with a round of practice, right? So, you're going into that experience in a regulated mindset, a positive place before you even introduce the trigger. Then you're going to introduce your trigger and do your round of practice, and then redirect back or re engage into whatever you're doing, whatever tasks you're doing in your daily life. We don't stop to kind of check in and see how we're doing with that food, because again, when we do that, that reinforces to the limbic system that there is potentially something to look for, something could be off, right? Whereas if we go about the rest of our day or back into our tasks at hand, we can see that, we're sending that limbic system the message that all is well. And then later on, if you have any symptoms or reactions coming up, again, you use your tools, ideally a full round of practice, but even a shortened version, or at the very least, stop, 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 and redirecting into, a task at hand, preferably something with an elevated emotion. Again, sends your limbic system the message that this is not life threatening to you, right? So when we look at, what is going on with the limbic system when it reacts to things, whether that's food or chemicals or other things, energy output, what's happening in the limbic system is that it's determined certain things or certain activities are threatening to you. And so it sets off a survival response, right? And so, a big part of our job when we're brain retraining is to teach our limbic system that we are not under threat by these activities, by introducing these foods, by being out in the world in, the environment or whatever, right? So that is a big part of our role, is to actively direct the limbic system and calm the nervous system so that it retrains that pattern. So that's a patterned response, and we're retraining it to a new patterned response of one of well-being, one where, we recognize, okay, this isn't a threat to me, it's okay for me to have this or to do this activity or to be in this place. And that's the repetition part of rewiring the limbic system that becomes really important. Now, with foods, depending on your level of sensitivity to those foods to begin with, we want to sort of set up your incremental training to be that it's a slight push outside of your comfort zone. So you start there and then you work your way up. So let's say there's something that's incredibly triggering to you, right? You would start initially with maybe seeing that thing or having it in your presence. Then you might, and do your rounds of practice with that. Then you might work up to actually holding it in your hand or putting it to your lips and work with that. And then you work up to, having a small amount, and then so on and so forth. So we're gradually building our capacity to incrementally train. Now, if it's something that you're not extreme, you don't have that kind of extreme reaction initially, then you can start with just a little bit of that food internally right away, and then go to your rounds of practice. And I recommend to people, when you're first introducing foods again, to really pick things that you want to introduce into your diet, things that you're excited about having, things that would bring some kind of joy or appreciation or gratitude by being able to have those things. And the reason being is that if we can have a positive experience with it, like it's something that we're looking forward to. We've already got a built-in elevated emotion to assist us, right? And so you've already got that neurochemistry of this is something I'm looking forward to. And that's helps support the rewiring process, right? So when it's something we're excited about or something we're looking forward to, or it brings us joy, we've got some good neurochemistry already in our system that will help to calm the threat and survival response. And so I often recommend to people, start there. Start with the things that you're excited about most and set yourself up for success. Meaning, we start with small, little incremental trainings in order to build some success and some proficiency at the retraining. So sometimes people will go to this idea that the higher or the bigger we incrementally train, the faster we're going to make progress, right? So rather than seeing incremental training as something that you just push yourself slightly outside of your comfort zone and then pair it with rounds of practice and active redirection and elevated emotion, sometimes people will see or think that, if I do a really big leap forward and then redirect and do my practices, that I'm going to get further faster. But that's generally not the case. I often say less is more because truthfully, we just want to step just outside of our comfort zone. We want to trigger the limbic system and then pair that with our rounds of practice and our active redirection and our elevated emotion to teach the limbic system that we are safe and that it's okay. If you do a massive retraining outside of your training zone, I would say, you're pushing yourself really hard, you're stimulating that stress and survival response so much that it sometimes becomes difficult then to actively redirect and pull ourselves out of it. And so it actually makes retraining harder. So from that perspective, less is more. Yes, we want to be able to step outside of our comfort zone a little bit. We want to push the edges of that comfort because change doesn't happen in our comfort zone, right? We have to push those edges and actively redirect in order for the changes to happen. But when we just do a small incremental training or a small stepping outside of the comfort zone and then pairing that with rounds of practice, it sets our limbic system up for an easier time to then come back into regulation and an easier time for us to actively redirect to something else. We're not so deeply pulled into that experience that it becomes more difficult, to come out. So hopefully that makes some sense. And that helps. And just to remember, when you do encounter, like Glenda, you were saying that you've run into a few setbacks. So when we do encounter dips or difficult experiences, just know that that is part of the retraining experience. It's very rarely getting better and better and better and like level, just that linear improvement all the way along. Often there are ups and downs along the way. And one of the things to consider or to look at when we're having those ups and downs is sort of the bigger picture context or perspective of what else is going on, what else is potentially triggering, our system, right? And so if we have a lot of other stressors in sort of the bigger picture context happening at this moment, know that that might slow down your progress with incremental training on food or whatever it is that you're training on. And so, when we think about training within our training zone, we also want to keep in that bigger picture perspective of and context of what all else is happening or going on at any given time. And to know that dips sometimes are par for the course, and that doesn't mean that we aren't getting better and better. Like, we want to be able to step back from that momentary experience and look at the bigger perspective, the bigger picture, or the overall trajectory of our recovery and where we're going. Oftentimes with the limbic system, if we encounter a dip, it will start to fire those thought processes of, oh, here we go again. I'm never getting better. I'm never going to get these foods, et cetera, et cetera. You could all fill in the blanks. I'm sure everybody kind of has their own version of what the limbic system will throw at them in terms of belief systems or thought processes about the fact that maybe there was a little bit of a setback, right? But if we understand in that bigger picture perspective or context that setbacks tend to happen, that's life inevitably comes up, stressors come up, things happen. We go through those ups and downs. And oftentimes it's how we handle those experiences that determine how quickly we pull ourselves out of them. So when we can catch that thought pattern of, oh, here we go again, and instead go to our retraining or elevation of emotional states, maybe we look at the bigger picture context of what is happening in our life. Are there stressors that we can minimize or change? Are there other things that we can be doing? Maybe we haven't been elevating our emotional state as much as we could be. When we look at that bigger picture context of how can I best support myself through this experience, knowing that it's temporary, knowing that it's going to change, that's when oftentimes those dips become more minimal. We can move out faster and back onto our more positive, trajectory. So hopefully that helps and answers your question. So there's another question here. How does this work if the issue is on a cellular level and the body reacts automatically? So if you think about, excuse me, our brain, only 5% of what is happening in our brain or the operation of our brain is actually on the conscious level. 95% is subconscious, right? And so those are, the automatic reactions that you're talking about here, that oftentimes it isn't something that we're consciously thinking of. It's something that's happening automatically below conscious awareness that fires. And that's what we're doing when we're engaging in tools to regulate our nervous system and to change our limbic system, is to change those subconscious patterns or programming that are firing automatically. So if you think about that, the first step to change is starting to bring to conscious awareness what is happening subconsciously, right? So as we start to bring conscious awareness to the firing that's going on, the automatic habitual reactions or patterns that we have, when we bring them into conscious awareness and we start to become aware of them, that's when we can actually start to engage with them and to change that pattern or programming. So depending on what it is specifically that you're talking about, sometimes it's really helpful to get familiar with, okay, what are the warning signs or the patterned responses or body sensations that lead up to that automatic cellular level response. And oftentimes we can find that there are certain thought patterns that we entertain. There may be physical sensations, that come up that lead us. They're like our little indicator, right? The kind of warning light, check engine light on the dash of your car, that tell us we're headed down that path. And if we can become aware of what those are and cultivate that level of awareness, then oftentimes we can step in with our tools and our retraining before it becomes that full blown response. And when we can catch it earlier like that, it actually becomes easier to retrain around it. Sometimes when we're in a full blown reaction, it is more difficult to pull ourselves out. It's kind of like what I was talking about a little bit earlier with incremental training. If we do something so big that we're fully entrenched in a stress response, it becomes harder to pull ourselves out, right? Whereas when we do something little, it's easier. Similar with this, if we can start to become aware of, okay, what are the cues that we're headed down that path, and we intervene, then it becomes easier to thwart that automatic reaction. And the more often we do that, the more we interrupt and change the outcome, the sooner your limbic system learns, okay, this is no longer our pattern response, right? Like this was the pattern response at one point in time, but here we are repeating a new pattern over and over and over again. The limbic system learns, okay, we have a new pattern response now. And eventually that becomes the automatic way that the limbic system will fire, or the automatic way of responding. Um, so hopefully that helps with that, and for times that we don't catch ourselves, and I'm sure we all have times like that, you find yourself in the midst of a situation or circumstance where there is that full-blown reaction. That is where you do whatever you can in that moment to calm and regulate your system. And the moment that you can start to catch it and start to actively redirect it, then that's where you do that. So for people who are doing the Gupta program, it might be something like the soften and flow meditation that you do, to kind of help move you through that experience. And then once you come out the other side, that's when you re-engage, in your retraining tools. For those doing other programs, whatever you can do to help settle your nervous system, right? To calm and regulate your system, whatever tools you have to do that, you embark or engage in those tools. And then once things come to a level where you can actively redirect, then that's the time to actively step in and change that programming or that process. All right. How to incrementally train for dental work or cleanings every 4 months that there is little discomfort with. However, my limbic system explodes with intense bodily sensations for weeks or months after. All right. So, I mean, the fact that your limbic system goes into that kind of response for weeks or months afterwards tells us exactly that it's limbic, right? So, that's the first thing to keep in mind. If this was an actual non-limbic response to an intervention that was happening through dentistry, you wouldn't see that prolonged, month after still responding like it was just there, right? And so that's the first thing, or one of the biggest pieces that we want to keep in mind, is that knowledge of, okay, this is a limbic reaction. Because if we can understand and believe that this is just a matter of how our limbic system is operating, then we also know that we can do things to actively change and redirect the limbic system. So, what I would suggest as a starting point would be in your imagination. So, in your imagination, before your rounds of practice, you're going to bring up going to the dentist, or the memory of the last time you went to the dentist. And you're going to pair that immediately with a round of practice. Now, with incremental training in this way, we don't have to spend a long time cultivating that experience, right? Like, you don't have to go into all of the details of what it was like. My guess is that the way that your limbic system is firing, that the moment you think dentist, it's already opened that file into working memory. And that's what we want with incremental training. We want to open the file in working memory and then go into our rounds of practice and active redirection to change the outcome of how our brain responds to that file. So from that perspective, you just want to bring it to your conscious awareness. Don't spend a long time there. Just bring it to your conscious awareness and then immediately go into rounds of practice. And I would work with it that way for a while, until you start to be able to even think about or imagine going to the dentist without it bringing up bringing up the level of response that it's bringing up. So in a sense, that incremental training, we're turning the volume down on the intense response that your system has to that. Once you can think about going to the dentist and stay in a more sort of calm and regulated place, that's when I would change the format from incremental training to putting it into a future visualization, where you then see yourself perfectly calm and capable of going to the dentist and having a positive experience and coming out totally regulated and all good, right? But oftentimes it takes us time to work up to that place where we can put it in a future visualization and not react. So when we think about, what's the purpose of the future visualization, it's a mental rehearsal. It's preparing our brain for change so that when we actually step out into the world outside of us and start to do those things, our limbic system doesn't see it as anything different because it doesn't distinguish between what we do in our imagination and what's happening in our external reality. So that's the mental rehearsal part. That's the preparation for change, right? So we play things out in our imagination, imagine them going smoothly, or if there is a hiccup, we overcome that hiccup effortlessly, and then we continue on and all is well. When we do that, then when we go and have that experience, the brain is like, oh yeah, we've done this before, because it doesn't make that differentiation or distinguish between the fact that it was in our imagination previously and now it's outside in the external world. And so, but in order for that to be useful, in order for us to have good mental rehearsal, we have to be able to stay in a place where all is well in that mental rehearsal, right? So if we're bringing up a future visualization and we're actually going into a stress response because we don't believe that that's, going to be a positive experience, or we still have a lot of triggers around that experience, you're actually not setting yourself up for that change, right? And so in those cases, you're better off using different future visualizations that you can stay in a place of well-being, and to continue to work with the thing that triggers you as an actual trigger in your rounds until you come to a place where you can put it in your future visualization and see things going well for you. And so, so there's a few suggestions there, right? So we use it as a trigger, and then we get to a place of putting it in your future visualization. I would also suggest, when you have a response that's that deep and prolonged, that there are probably some thought patterns and limiting beliefs around the dentist and what that means to you, to your limbic system more specifically, or your subconscious. And so that's where it would be helpful to get really curious about, what do I actually believe about going to the dentist? And there are a few different ways to do that. That's something that you could work with a coach. If you have a coach that you're working with, you could do some expressive writing around that. So that would look like, 10 to 15 minutes of writing uncensored in one go, of all of the thoughts and beliefs you have about going to the dentist. And for that period of time, you're going to write and you're going to continue to write. So even if you feel like you have nothing else to write about, keep your pen moving. Because as you keep your pen moving, what will happen is you'll get to more of the unconscious or deeper subconscious beliefs or thoughts about dentistry, and that will help us to uncover any limiting beliefs that are actually getting in the way of your retraining efforts around that topic. And so yeah, I would give that a go. And sometimes when we uncover those limiting beliefs, sometimes even just that awareness of, oh, okay, that's what's going on in my system, can, by bringing that to conscious awareness, sometimes that can be enough then for that protective part to slow down or to let go a little bit so that we can make gains with our retraining. And sometimes it requires a little bit more in-depth, working with the part of you that has that belief. And again, if you're doing the Gupta program, you can use parts work for that. If you're not, then I would suggest you work with a coach around that, because that's a difficult thing to do on your own without active direction. Now, before I go on, I just want to say sometimes people confuse or think that if we're doing parts work, we have to do, internal family systems, go into huge depth around all the parts and the way that IFS, or internal family systems, works with parts. I just want to be clear that when we're brain retraining, that level or depth of parts work is not necessary in order to make changes or gains around, the limiting beliefs or the protective mechanisms that come up. Oftentimes it is more a matter of cultivating awareness of what those limiting beliefs are, what the protective parts are, or the parts that are trying to defend you, and keep you safe, what those parts are, and engaging in updating those parts with new information, right? With the understanding that they no longer need to play that role in order for you to be well. And in fact, the role that they're playing is outdated and it's actually keeping you stuck. It's not helping you move forward in your health and well-being. And, other than cultivating an awareness and having that kind of a dialogue or conversation with those parts, or you can do that by talking to your limbic system. I mean, it's the same thing, really. Um, Outside of that, nothing else is really required in terms of parts work in order for you to make progress. So I just want to make that clear because sometimes people get confused around that. All right. So next question. So when life events happen, how to get back to doing the work, and that's a really good one, and especially a good question, and especially for people who've been doing brain retraining for a long time. It's easy to lose that motivation, to feel like, oh, I have to get back, here we go again. You start to encounter resistance around incorporating that into your daily routine again, and that's really common. Just know that for a start, right? It's you're not the only one who runs into resistance, even though you may have had a past experience of doing really well with the rounds and how much they benefit you, and yet here you are, having an experience of, I just can't make myself do it. So there's a few things that are really helpful, um, that are really helpful in moving you forward when you're in that place. For one thing, I would say one of the biggest things it would be to change up your routine around that. So our brain likes novelty, and sometimes going back to the same old thing actually makes it difficult for us to be able to do that in a way that gets us benefits. So it could be as simple as changing up your languaging, maybe changing up your gestures that you're doing with your rounds of practice. That would be a good place to start. Sometimes if people have been doing one retraining program for a long time, they'll jump into a different program and just have that sort of beginner's mind, fresh start. Let's approach this from a slightly different perspective. And sometimes that can be, really useful as well. And getting a little bit more creative about how you're doing things. So your languaging, your gestures, what you're using for memories and future visualizations, those can start to get stale after a while. And so really looking at, what else can I infuse in here? And the memories don't have to be accurate, right? Like they don't have to be um perfectly in alignment with what actually happened. And in fact, our memories are so fallible, what we think actually happened probably isn't, a super accurate version of what actually happened. So it doesn't really matter, And so an example of that would be maybe you remember as a younger person or a child, there was an activity that you really liked to do, but you don't necessarily have specific memories around that. You could actually create memories, you go back to like for me, I love to jump on the trampoline when I was young. That was one of my favorite things in the world. And so I could go back and I could recreate or create, memories or stories around that, bouncing up in the air and feeling like I was flying and, the sun shining and all of these parts around an activity that I know used to bring me a lot of joy. Right. And so, you start to look at like, what are some of those things, some of those things that brought you joy or that that you engaged in, and creating some memories around that. Future visualizations, again, we want to have a variety, right? So you might have some big visualizations, kind of bucket list stuff. You might have smaller, sort of everyday activities, seeing yourself navigating them smoothly, and some kind of happy medium somewhere in the middle there. And really, spend some time thinking about more about like how would I like to be in the world as opposed to the activities that you're doing. And sometimes that sense of this is how I want to be, this is how I want to navigate life, connecting with that can also help re-inspire and remotivate us to getting into, more of the practicing again habitually. And that actually brings me up to another point around that. And that would be, really connecting with your motivation, connecting with your why. So, this is another thing that I've seen quite a bit in my over a decade of coaching brain retrainers is that sometimes people will get to a certain level of functioning and recovery and then they lose motivation, right? It's like, it feels like too much work or life happens and they just want to re-engage in life. They don't want to engage in the tools anymore. There's not that level of motivation to kind of go the distance because they're now functioning at a level that's, passable, right? And maybe they started at a level that really wasn't. And so for them, it's like, there's not a lot of motivation to keep going. And so I see this, I've seen this quite a bit, right? And yet that's not your optimal level of recovery. And often if you have a conversation with people, they can tell you, well, this is what I'd like to change and this is how I would like to be and all of those positive pieces, but they no longer have that motivation that they used to because their functioning is better than it used to be. And so that's where we need to sort of reconnect with our why. Why is it important for you to go from where you are now to a more optimal level of recovery, and clear on what that optimal level of recovery looks like? Like what would be available to you, that's not available to you now? And why is it important for you to have that? What difference would that make in your life? And then once you get clear on that, what difference would that make in your life? Then you start to look at what are you willing to do to get there, right? And that's where I think it becomes really important to get clear, right? Like get clear on how important is this to you and what are you willing to do, and to recognize that life works on commitment. Life changes on commitment. And so it's that level of self discipline that enables us to go from A to B. And what a lot of people get caught up in, is this idea of waiting until they feel like it, right? I don't feel like retraining. I feel like this is too much work. But as we know, Joe Dispenza's one of his favorite lines, and I wholeheartedly agree, is that in order to change, we have to think greater than how we feel. If we're waiting until we feel like it, we could very well be waiting till the cows come home, right? And it's not necessarily going to lead to consistent practice and retraining. Whereas if we invoke our commitment, right, we dig deep to that quality and that characteristic of commitment and self-discipline, and we set our goal of, okay, every day I'm going to do this, right? And it might not be the full picture of everything that you want to do, but you start somewhere. You start with, okay, I'm going to do 2 rounds a day or whatever it is. You find a place that's doable that you start. You make that commitment to yourself to do that. Set a time of day that works for you to do that. And the more consistent you can be about that time of day, the easier it will become, that just becomes part of your routine, right? You're not constantly sort of going through that navigation process every day of, oh, I've got to do this, but I want to do this first and I'll make this a priority. And then maybe later, and then maybe this afternoon. And then you get to this afternoon and you actually feel like the laundry needs to be done first, like that's how life goes, right? And so if we set a time of day, like this is my time of day to practice, set a timer for yourself if you need to, or an alarm, and make that commitment, and maybe start with a week or start with 2 weeks, right? So you've got, okay, for the next week or the next 2 weeks at 10 a.m. every day, I'm going to do, my couple rounds of practice or whatever it is that you're committing to, and start there. And then you reevaluate after your week or 2 weeks are up. And then you start to add other pieces onto that, right? So maybe you go from doing 2 rounds to an hour of practice, or maybe you go from doing 2 rounds to a couple of activities in the day that elevate your emotional state, or you make a concerted effort to really catch those automatic negative thought patterns or pops or whatever it happens to be, and you build your way back up, all the while reminding yourself of the why, reminding yourself of your motivation. And you might even want to put that on a post-it note, whatever your why is, maybe on the fridge or the bathroom mirror or something, whatever your why is, put that out there so that you're seeing that, you're reminding yourself of that, and you might include in that what's available to you that's not now, or maybe that's something that's in a journal or on a piece of paper that you review once in a while. But start with that, and hopefully that will help to get you, back on track and motivated to continue going. And so there's a question here from Natalie about explaining the phases of recovery. So I'm not sure what you're talking about there. I'm assuming that might be something that's been added in DNRS since I left. So if you want to come, if you are comfortable and you want to come off of mute and talk to me about that, we can do that. Or if you want to type in what you're referring to by the phases of recovery, that would be helpful for me to know the languaging of what exactly it is you're talking about there. And while we're waiting for that, there's another question here. You're already speaking to this, I think, and not sure how to best summarize, but I think I'm looking for tools that are short and sweet, or maybe ways to tweak DNRS and other tools to be more short and sweet. I find myself struggling to train when life is moving really fast, lots of family changes and financial pressures. This has been going on for years, and I have built in as many outside supports as possible. My two biggest challenges are finding time to use my tools and then creating a structure that actually works for me and that I stick with. That's a really good question as well. Oftentimes we can find ourselves getting immersed or bombarded by life, right? The activities of daily life, and that sometimes it throws a wrench in our plans, right? And so the things that I talked about before definitely are useful here as well, but also to recognize that when you're in a situation like this, regulating your nervous system becomes paramount. So that's where, breath work and meditation and slowing it down becomes really important, because what happens is life comes along and then we start to feel the overwhelm, right? And as soon as we feel the overwhelm, we know that we're in a stress response. We know that we're not in the pathways and the neurochemistry that's going to be supportive or optimal to us moving forward. And when we're in that place of overwhelm, what often happens is that people, we start to get that feeling of pressure of everything needs to happen at once. So I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but I certainly have, where if I'm a little bit stressed or overwhelmed, all of a sudden everything on my to-do list looks incredibly important and like it needs to be done today. And there may be things on that to-do list that have waited months and can wait longer, right? But because my system is in that frame of mind of, oh my gosh, there's so much to do, when we're in that kind of a stress response, we don't have access to our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of us that helps, to see that bigger picture perspective and to discern and prioritize, what actually does need to be done versus what can wait. The other thing that happens when we're in that state of overwhelm is we tend to spend a lot of time spinning our wheels, right? So we may go from one activity to the next. We might start something and not finish it and then move on to the next. And then we've got like 3 or 4 projects or sometimes more all going at the same time. And then we feel like, again, that overwhelm or that incapacity to navigate. And so that again is where we really want to slow it down. We want to start to do things one thing at a time. And it can be helpful to take a moment, to prioritize each day. It's like, okay, What is the necessities today? What is the priority that I need to get done today? And to set yourself up for success. So if you take 5 minutes out of your morning to kind of come up with a plan, it's like, okay, so for today, this absolutely has to get done. And that's what's on your list. And there may be other things that you'd like to get to if you have time, but they're not fundamental to getting done that day. Right. And so you start with the things that you absolutely have to. And then the things that aren't fundamental, if we get to them, that's a bonus. Right. And when we prioritize and when we take the time to clarify, this is what we're doing. And we start with one thing and we go through and we do that one thing and we finish that one thing. And then you go to the next thing and you go through and you do that next thing and you finish that next thing, and then maybe there's a third thing, right? And we take it one step at a time and we're clear on where our energy and resources need to go that day. You're less likely to get so overwhelmed that you become incapacitated, and when we become in that state, it becomes hard to get anything done. And the things that we are doing generally take a lot longer. So by,
I,
yeah,
I interject because,
yeah,
that's something I've been working on for a long time. I've always had my list and I try to look at it the night before so I can,
yeah,
but it's always like there are 20 things that have to be, like, the list is just long, and it's things that are time sensitive and people depending on me, and
right,
so I don't know how to deal with that.
yeah, yeah. So a couple of things around that, and I know that we've mentioned this or we've had this conversation before, is really looking at like what can you delegate and what can you recruit help with, right? And so there, and then streamlining, the things that you do need to do. So the things that are an absolute must, is there a way to do them more efficiently, right? And some of the things that we talked about was a checklist, right? A checklist of, okay, I do this, 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 and this. And so that you're not, again, spinning your wheels around, okay, what did I do, what comes next? We want to streamline that a little bit. And really look at, is there a way to recruit help when and where you can? And if we cannot recruit help and we cannot delegate, then we also need to reassess exactly, what is the level of priority or importance for this? Because again, when we're in that limbic overwhelm, everything feels like it needs to be done, and it's a necessity. When we step back from that and we take the time to do our practice rounds and to meditate or breathe and calm our nervous system, we start to recognize that some of the things that felt like this absolutely is a necessity and has to get done, it turns out it actually doesn't. It turns out that those things can wait. And it helps us to kind of reevaluate, what the priorities are. And the thing about slowing it down, people often think, well, if I slow it down, then I'm going to have less time to get things done. But what actually happens when we take ourselves out of that stress response and we take the time to slow it down, we're actually more efficient and effective and more productive. So we end up actually getting more done in the long run than if we stay in that dysregulated, running around like a chicken with our head cut off kind of a response. And the bonus of the slowing down and the regulating as you're going along, or taking breaks in there to do that, is then you're actually retraining your nervous system and your limbic system to be able to navigate when you're in a situation that there is more things to do than you have resources to do them. You're actually learning how to navigate that from a non-stressed regulated state. And that, not only does that rewire your limbic system, but that's good life skills, right? That's a good life skills. We want to be able to have that flexibility of being able to, come in and out of a stress response as needed or necessary, and to be able to go, okay, there's a lot going on, but that doesn't mean that my internal world needs to get caught up in all of the things that are going on, right? And that takes practice, and that takes, retraining, right? So yeah, good question for sure. No, you will not get the recording of the Q&A, but it will be posted on my website. So as soon as I figure out how to do that, so that might give me a minute to figure that out. But once it's up and available, you are more than welcome to come back and to re-listen to the recording anytime. Absolutely, as opposed to sending it out to people, it just makes more sense to do it that way. All right, so the
Candy is,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry, just wondering if we could circle back to my question. This is Natalie.
Oh yes, hi Natalie.
Hi, thanks so much for offering your time for us. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
As far as my question about the phases, yeah, I've just heard from some people that have recovered and a couple coaches as well, that there's these 3 phases of recovery. Phase 1 is really, lots of dose and mood elevation and of course labeling limbic system. And then phase 2 is more about an emotional release and maybe some trauma healing and coming back to our body and learning that all emotions are safe. And then phase 3 is reintegration into life, emerge and thrive.
Yeah.
So not sure if you have any comments about that. I know this might be.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I would say that's true for some people, but not all. I wouldn't necessarily say categorically that everybody goes through those phases, especially phase 2 that you're talking about, because, for people with a history of complex trauma, that might be relevant, but not everybody with limbic system impairment has that type of history, right? And so that's where, I would caution putting a label on this is the trajectory and this is the way that it is, for everybody. That being said, I would say there definitely is some value and validity to the notion of being able to navigate our feelings, in the sense of, oftentimes people who have gone through limbic impairment have experienced a level of grief and loss, grief and loss around what has resulted as a result of having this experience, not to mention sometimes, obviously other previous losses and grieving. And when there are genuine emotions like that, it is absolutely imperative that we give ourselves the time and the space to move those emotions through us. So there is a distinct difference between limbic system driven, emotional states and actual emotions like grief and loss that are part of our human experience that are meant to be moved through. So if you think about emotions are energy in motion. And that energy in motion or emotion is a signal to us. That's what emotions were designed for, to get our attention, to signal us that there is something that needs to be attended to or moved through. Now, what sometimes happens with some brain retraining programs is that all emotions get categorically put into the box of limbic dysfunction and you don't entertain any of them. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, that will actually slow down their progress of recovery. Because if there is grief and loss or other emotions that we have in our system that we're not attending to, then we're using a lot of energy and resources to repress those emotions, right? Those are energy and resources that we need in order to heal. And the more we repress it, it's not going away, it's stuck in the system. And so the way forward is to be able to make space to feel the feelings for the things that we cannot change and to allow that to move through you. And there are different tools that you can use to do that. The expressive writing that I mentioned earlier is one of them. 10 to 15 minutes writing uncensored, being as honest and open as possible, deepest, darkest thoughts and feelings, around a particular event or context. And if you were to do that activity, usually it would be done 10 to 15 minutes a day for 3 days on one particular, topic that is needing release. That's a way to do it if you're doing it on your own. you know, working with somebody else, or if you have somebody in your life that has the capacity to witness you and to be a listening, non-judgmental presence that gives you the space to share those things, you know, that is another option. But it does need to be released or moved out of you. So by writing it down or talking out loud to somebody trusted, you know, that is a way of doing that. Right. And what just popped into my mind there is you could also talk, let's say you have a relationship with a divine being or a belief in a higher power. You could have that talk with them too. It doesn't have to be, you know, a physical human being in order to do that. But it does need to give that space for those things to move through you. And so there's a lot of research actually on chronic illness and expressive writing, and showing that how when we release these parts or these things that have been stuck in our system, that it actually helps people heal and move forward. And I guess the tricky part really is discerning, okay, so what's limbic and what's legitimate human emotion, you know, that needs to be addressed or dealt with. And I can see why, you know, those phases that you were talking about, you know, why the people discussing that would say, you know, do your rewiring and get your dose, you know, your happy feel good chemicals sort of set first, and then look at, you know, these other pieces, because from that place you'll be able to more accurately discern, you know, is this just a limbic loop, or is this a genuine, you know, emotion that is needing to be, you know, needing space and needing to be moved through, right? And yeah, so making space for that. And again, even with the expressive writing, 10 to 15 minutes a day for 3 days, it's not something that you would continue ongoing. You make space to have the feelings and to move that energy through you, and then you move on, right? And if you're noticing outside of those times where you're doing that, or you're having your external conversation, you know, with somebody, that your limbic system is trying to ruminate on it, like it's getting caught up in the thought processes or thought patterns around it, that's when you want to treat that as a pop or as an automatic negative thought pattern, and stop and actively redirect, because the limbic system will sometimes try to jump on board in that way. But what you notice, you know, is that limbic loop is all in the thinking process, right? It's all in your brain. It's the thought patterns, which sometimes will then lead to emotional states, but it's originating up here. Whereas when it's a genuine emotion, it's heartfelt, right? It's more coming from the body and from you know, and sometimes even in a sensation in the body, that when you give attention to it, it turns into emotion and it releases in that way. So and again, different people need to do that to varying degrees. Not everybody has a lot stuck in that way, but it is important, as we're looking at returning to optimal well-being and wholeness, to be able to have a level of tolerance for emotions, right? To be able to feel our feelings without them overtaking us or overwhelming us. And part of that is learning that it's okay to feel those feelings, and that if we give them space to move through us, then they don't overtake us in that context of where, you know, the brain sometimes thinks, right? And oftentimes when we're caught in that place of overwhelmed with emotions, it's because we haven't allowed the space for those to move through you. So, you know, if it is something that is challenging, again, I would suggest working with a coach, or in this case, somebody who's trained, like either in therapy or counseling, or somebody who has actual training in beyond just a brain retraining program, that could actually support you, you know, in moving through that. If you're comfortable with that on your own, and you feel like you've got a handle on that, then by all means, you know, the expressive writing or talking to somebody in your life that can just be a witness, so that you can have space to move through that, you know, that's great too. Does that answer your question, Natalie, or was there anything else about that?
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate your thorough response.
Of course, my pleasure. My pleasure. All right, so next question. I often question and get confused about my situation. My system is in such a hypervigilant, excitotoxic state in the brain and nervous system, it doesn't seem to budge. I often go back to the benzo injury situation because it affects the GABA receptors and glutamate receptors, not just the limbic system. There's a whole world of information out there about that injury, but this puts me into a state of feeling helpless or that something is different than. The state I am in is just so extremely strong and hypervigilant, it's hard not to act on it. This has been a challenge to feel any sort of progress of calm. This state is very strong and not budging. Yeah. And, when we're stuck in significant limbic dysfunction, it does often feel that way. We can feel so overwhelmed and overtaken by specific, states or thought processes that it feels virtually impossible, to pull ourselves out of it. And what we need to recognize with that is part of that is the story that the limbic system is telling you, right? And that there are ways to calm our system. And sometimes it's a matter of finding, what works specifically for your system, and also a matter of challenging the limiting beliefs around what that means for you and what recovery means for you. And so, with any topic of conversation, whether it's a benzo injury or whether it's other topics, we can find all kinds of information out there to support whatever that belief system is, right? The internet is filled with stories and information about how bad something is for you or what something has done or what have you. That's true. And there are lots of people who have had difficult stories and difficult recoveries. There are also lots of people who came off benzodiazepines and were fine. There's lots of people who had injuries and recovered, right? And so what we have to recognize is that information that our limbic system is targeted towards or focusing on is one part of a much bigger picture perspective. And this is what the limbic system does, right? It kind of narrows in. It's like a horse with blinders on. It kind of narrows in to one specific thing or belief, and then only filters in information that fits with that belief system, and will filter out anything to the contrary, right? That's how the limbic system works. And so part of our role is to take those blinders off and expand our perspective. And in order to do that, we have to start challenging some of the limiting beliefs that might come up around what the limbic system is telling us about that. And, for some people, it's helpful to think about other people that have recovered, or to listen to, stories or read testimonials, whether it's on the exact same thing or something else. Joe Dispenza and his work, there's some amazing, what would be considered medical miracles happening all the time, right? And what that tells us or shows us is that our brain is capable and our nervous system are capable of far more than we give them credit for, if we can find the right way to activate them that serves us in moving forward. And that's the part where sometimes people get stuck, and sometimes the limiting beliefs actually hinder our capacity or our ability to do that. And so, my suggestion to you would be to find information that are an ability to challenge the limiting beliefs in your limbic system. I wouldn't necessarily say go out and research. So finding information maybe isn't the best wording there. But to start to challenge that belief, and what comes to mind is there's a process by Byron Katie called The Work, and it's 4 questions. I'm not going to get into the whole detail, but one of the things that she asks is, or one of the things that she encourages people to do is ask themselves, is that true? And if the answer is yes, then the next question would be, is that really true? Do we know 100% definitively, certainly, that is the only truth out there? I think the answer to that is no, for pretty much the vast majority of things. And so then that opens space to, what if the opposite were true? And that's a really good question to contemplate. What if the opposite of what I've been buying into as a limiting belief is actually the truth? What then? And then that opens up that window of perspective to start to see a little bit more of the bigger picture, and to start to take in the possibility that things could actually change when they feel like they're stuck. So on that note, we're just over an hour, and I want to give us time to do a little bit of breath work and meditation. So for anyone who wants to stay for that, it would be lovely to have you. If you want to bow out, you're done with a Q&A, that's totally fine too. There is great value in breath work and meditation for regulating our nervous system and calming our brain. So again, this is part of the reason why I'm offering this as part of our Q&A. You know, it's another way to help calm the mind and regulate the limbic system and the nervous system, and can really help to promote resilience, you know, which is something I think we're all looking for, regardless of where we are in our trajectory of recovery. So the type of breath work that we're going to do today, let's do alternate nostril breathing. So for those of you who are already familiar with that, you can go ahead and start, you know, do some alternate nostril breathing. For those who are new to this, I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll guide you through it, and we can do a little bit together. So it looks like this. You're putting your fingers on the bridge of your nose, and you're using your thumb and your ring finger to alternately plug your nostrils, right? So it's alternate nostril breathing. So we're breathing in and out of one nostril at a time. And so if you want to do that with me, you're just going to take your two fingers, place them between your eyebrows, take a deep breath in, and then you're going to plug your right nostril with your thumb, and you're going to breathe out your left nostril. And then breathing in your left nostril, plug it with your ring finger and breathe out your right nostril. Breathing in the right. Switching and breathing out the left. Breathing in the left. Switching and breathing out the right. Continuing on, breathing in the right. Switch and breathe out. And if you're comfortable with this now, you can close your eyes, breathing in the left. And starting to prolong your breaths a little bit, breathing out the right. Making them a little bit deeper in and out, breathing in the right. And switch. Breathing in the left. Switch. Breathing in the right. Switch. Breathing in the left. Switch. Breathing in the right. Switch. And let's do one more round. Breathing in the left. Switch. Breathing in the right. Switch, breathing out the left. When you finish breathing out the left, you can release your hand into your lap, leaving your eyes closed for a moment. Just noticing how you feel just after that few moments of alternate nostril breathing, noticing how you feel inside. And then from this space, we're going to go into a meditation. So closing your eyes, sitting easily and comfortably. Taking a deep breath in. And let go. Taking another deep breath in. And let go. Listening to the sounds around you. You might hear traffic. Maybe there's people talking. Perhaps there's the hum of an appliance or a fan. Accept all the noises around you. Accept all the noises. Be in harmony with your environment. Take a deep breath in and let go. Becoming aware of your physical body. Your body is a gift from nature or the divine. Become aware of your feet. Lower legs. Knees. Upper legs. Hips and pelvis. Lower abdomen. Stomach. Chest. Right shoulder and arm. Left shoulder and arm. deep breath in and let go. Become aware of your thoughts. They're good thoughts or not so good thoughts. Let them come. Do not resist any thoughts. Let them be. You are now in harmony with your thoughts. Take a deep breath in and let go. Become aware of your feelings. Peace and joy. any sensations in your body. Aware of the environment around you. Take a deep breath in and let go. And in your own time, slowly and gradually, whenever you're ready, you may open your eyes. How many people feel more peaceful and relaxing? Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Just less than 20 minutes, what we can do with a little breath work and meditation. So that concludes our first Q&A. So the next one will be, so it's going to be every second Saturday at the beginning of the month. So the next one will be in August. And I'm going to change the link a little bit so that people can register to come, so that I can send out an email reminder closer to the time. I didn't think about that when I didn't set it up for registrations. I just thought, oh, everybody can come, it'll be easy, but then there's no way of me reminding you of the link. So I'm going to change it a little bit. I'm hoping to use the same link. If it does have to be changed, I will post that both on my website and in the Rewiring Your Wellness blog. But I think I'm pretty sure I can do it with just the same link. So it just means that you need to go on and register, and then I can send you a confirmation email a little bit closer to the time. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. I wish you a beautiful weekend. I hope that this was helpful, and hopefully we'll see you next time. All right, bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.